Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about comparing ecosystems, specifically comparing the ecosystems of MariaDB and public code. My name is Eric. I'm a developer and I have been for the majority of my career. My career has mostly been commercial, although I did work for MySQL from 2004 to 2009. But even during that time frame, a lot of the work that I did was on their commercial proprietary products. So even during that time frame, it was mostly commercial work that I did. That said, I am a long-time contributor to free and open source software projects. You will see commits in MariaDB, in MySQL, in the Perl interpreters, Perl core, as well as a handful of other maybe less marquee projects. I have been involved with the MariaDB ecosystem for a while. I've been serving on the board of directors since 2015. Currently, I am the chairman of the board of directors, so I'm serving in that role at present. Professionally, I work for the Foundation for Public Code as a codebase steward. In my role as a codebase steward at the Foundation for Public Code, I often point to MariaDB as an example, usually as an example to copy, a template that we should follow. But occasionally I talk about it as a counterexample. We don't want to do it like this. And so I'll definitely be highlighting some of that throughout the course of this talk. So first off, what is public code? Public code is the combination of software and public policy that is produced for and by the public. And as we think about it, software is becoming core infrastructure. We see cities collaborating in order to build the applications and services that are essential for them to execute their mission, whether that is allowing me to register for some form of taxation online, or it is for me to renew a permit or schedule a big trash pickup or anything. Many of the things that we expect to be managed by a municipality or by a larger public organization are now software. And very often public policy is being specifically implemented in software. So much like roads and water and waste disposal are all things that we expect public organizations to at least manage, if not run the detailed execution of, software is also becoming core infrastructure. The Foundation for Public Code publishes the draft standard for public code. This is a document which collects the set of requirements that all the software that we depend on as infrastructure should measure up to. Now, if you're a professional software developer and you read through the standard, I expect you will find very few surprises. I think that everything in there is going to read to you like the typical best practice, mostly what you're doing today. If, like me, you don't have a deep background in public software development, then the first time you come across some of the things that are a bit more policy related, that might be new for you. But other than that, I don't think you'll be very surprised. At the Foundation, when we look at a code base, we look at it from the dimensions of quality, community, product, and support. And quality is what I do as a developer. I work with the developers and we take a look at the standard, we compare their code base to the standard, and we say, does it have the quality we expect? But a code base is so much more than just the code, and even more than the code and the developers. There's many more individuals that make up that community, and so it's not good enough to just stop there. We must have a view which is wide enough to encompass all the different people that are either deploying, maintaining, monitoring, running the software, the end users of the software, the citizens for which this software serves. So the community can be much, much broader than the developers who are making the code and the managers. And like commercial software, we expect that there's more than just code sitting in a repository. We expect it to have what's needed to get it installed. We expect it to have what's needed to understand how to run it, that it has the documentation and the other things that a complete product has that not all open source projects have. And of course, you may not be in a position where you want to or where you're even able to install, deploy, maintain the code base yourself, and you may want to contract out those services. And so is there a support network that's able to provide you the help that you need so that you can do what you need to do? And so those are the four things that we look at. And in our organization, we don't do advocacy. What we do is we work with code bases to make sure that they are achieving their goals in regards to these four areas, but we don't have to convince them. They're working with us because they're already on this road. There's other organizations that do advocacy. The Free Software Foundation Europe jumps to my mind as their Public Money, Public Code campaign. But the organizations that we work with, they've already decided to work in the open doing public code. When I think about the mission of the MariaDB Foundation, they talk about different pillars. They talk about continuity, collaboration, and ecosystem, which I already see some overlap, but one of the things that stands out is I think that they are a little bit broader. And then there's, of course, the mission of the MariaDB Corporation, as well as all the other big contributors that contribute to the MariaDB codebase, as well as all of us as individuals. We don't even have a mission statement necessarily. We're users of the product. So when I'm comparing MariaDB to the standard, or when I'm comparing MariaDB to one of the code bases that I'm working with, there are times when MariaDB has an obvious advantage, and that is that MariaDB has a gigantic ecosystem. There's all the work that's coming from all the developers employed by the MariaDB Corporation, as well as the engineering coming in from the likes of IBM and Tencent and Alibaba and everybody else that has made very, very interesting contributions over the years. And the user community is very large indeed. So we wouldn't expect that if you are a city developing a license renewal website, that even if you're in collaboration with several other cities that have a similar need, that you're going to have nearly the user base of something like MariaDB. We wouldn't expect that you'd have nearly the developer pool of something like the MariaDB server. So it's not always a perfect comparison, and that's not even anybody's fault. That's just because sometimes there's not a match. But one thing that comes up is, are we developing a reusable component? Are we developing software that is more than just going to be used in this one project that can be used in other projects elsewhere? Is it going to have a life that is bigger than this one instance? And this is a great place where I get to compare with MariaDB, because in the case of MariaDB, users start with an application, maybe with a WordPress site. They don't think to themselves, I want a MariaDB database. They may not even think to themselves, I want an SQL database. However, MariaDB is a component that is a default in many Linux systems or other systems. So that's a great example that I can point to, and I used recently when talking about OpenZoc, which is a case management component. And if you're a city and you're developing something which is going to have a case management aspect to it, you don't start by saying, I want this specific case management software. You start by saying, I want to deliver a service. But maybe you're delivering that service according to the Common Ground standard, which is it's a way to write applications that was standard described in the Netherlands. And the OpenZoc component fits into that Common Ground standard. And maybe OpenZoc becomes the default in that standard. And then anybody developing a Common Ground app maybe will naturally reach to OpenZoc as the first case management component that they would use. So that's an example where I get to draw a very close parallel. Another place that I get to draw a parallel is that, of course, collaboration comes with a cost. There's if nothing else, communication overhead in working with others. But I think about how MariaDB, the development started with one organization. Now we see development coming from many. Of course, there's the majority of development happening in the MariaDB Corporation, but we also see very interesting features coming from other places. And I think about the instant add column, which came from a brainstorm at MariaDB Unconference a couple of years back, and we had developers from Alibaba and MariaDB Corporation Naturally and Tencent sitting together in a room talking about a way they could do this. And the prototype was actually developed by one of the Tencent developers. So that is something that benefits us all. And even though it was solving a very specific use case that they had, that's now something that benefits everybody. And so that's a great example and makes it parallel to one of the things that I see with the Signalen project, which started in Amsterdam, specific to their needs, and the Association of Netherlands Municipalities started working with Amsterdam in order to replicate that. And then, of course, they needed to change things so that it would be appropriate in some of these other contexts, in some of these other cities they wanted to deploy to. But those changes were also beneficial to Amsterdam. So yes, there's cost in collaboration, but then, of course, the obvious benefit is that the other developers are developing things that are not your highest priority, but you will benefit from. And the first thing that I do when I think about MariaDB and my role is I think about, so how does MariaDB measure up to the standard that we publish? Well, so does MariaDB code in the open? Well, the answer is yes. And when I'm talking to development organizations, especially ones that are just making the transition from working in private or behind closed doors anyway, working in a closed fashion, to wanting to transition to working in an open fashion, they are understandably hesitant about all of the things that can come up. And I get to point to MariaDB and I get to say, hey, they have their public development branches on GitHub. They don't just do a big release at version boundaries and say, here's all the changes since last version. Instead, you see the code unfolding as developers are working on it. And you know what? These developers make mistakes. It's fine. We're not going and pointing at them. We're not holding our bellies and laughing at the mistakes they're making. Instead, we understand that that's a normal part of the development cycle. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we make dumb mistakes. That's fine. They get discovered. We talk them through, and we come up with a solution which doesn't have that mistake embedded in it. And so that's something where, even though it's scary, we can see that these developers don't have to be afraid, because we can point to the MariaDB ecosystem and say, look at the work that's being done there. You don't see that there's really anything to be afraid of there. And it's not that all the code is perfect at all. And one of the things about working in this way is things that we might have been sloppy about, or it might have been just expedient to do something like put some secret data into the repository. Now we know that if we're going to publish this, we can't just, because it's easy or expedient, commit a password here. We have to have good hygiene, have our secrets in a separate location, not in the codebase repository. So there's a natural advantage that comes up that we want anyway. And then as we are working, if we're working in the open and somebody else is working on a long-lived branch or maybe a patch set, if we're working in this incremental fashion, it allows them to track our work again in an incremental fashion. And that allows us to work with a much, much wider range of vendors or contributors or individuals. And the standard talks about building reusable and portable and extensible code. And when I point to MariaDB, I get to say that these are aspects that have contributed to the fantastic success of MariaDB. No matter what operating system you're running, no matter what architecture you're running on, you can run MariaDB. But also, this is a bit of a counterexample, because internally, MariaDB is not so modular. It's not so easy to reuse the bits and pieces. I'm not going to pull the parser out of MariaDB in order to examine the complexity or build a load balancer or something like that. So when I look for examples of systems that are internally well modularized and the pieces are reusable, I point to things like GNOME's glib, where projects that have nothing to do with GNOME are reusing bits and pieces of the glib libraries, or KDE frameworks, very much the same thing, where people who are writing things that aren't even intended to run on KDE are using some of the libraries that they developed to make writing KDE applications and writing KDE itself easier. And this lack of internal modularity is something that I think limits contributions, and I think that this is something that we as an organization, or as a community, as an ecosystem, I think this is something that we as an ecosystem, this is something that we should give some thought to. Is that a place we can improve? Something that's important for all open source code bases, whether public code or not, is that they welcome contributors. And if you are making the transition from developing in a closed fashion to developing in an open fashion, this is really hard. Part of why it's hard is that you probably don't have a lot of extra bandwidth for reviewing somebody else's contributions that are not in your highest priority things to do list. So you know that if you're working in the open, that you're going to have to invest in that. That takes a time commitment. And also, it's not a lot of fun to admit all of your mistakes in public, to have a public bug tracking system that anybody can look at and anybody can read and anybody can see. That's intimidating. And then we need to give serious thought to, okay, how is security issue reporting going to be? What's the right level of transparency for that? And then also, if we're making a public roadmap, which is important for encouraging contributions, because without a roadmap, it's very difficult for me to know whether or not I'm helping or whether I'm pulling the code base back in a direction it doesn't want to go. And so a publicly visible roadmap is useful to all contributors to know how their contribution slots in with the future as it may unfold. But a publicly visible roadmap also starts to feel like you're making promises, and you definitely need the freedom to be able to say, this is what I believe we're going to deliver, but this is not a promise of what we're going to deliver. And so articulating that well is important. So I think there's also room for improvement in the welcoming contribution of the MariaDB ecosystem. And specifically, what I detect is that there's a lot of undocumented tribal knowledge where all of us that are in the ecosystem have a sense of things that are not written down. For instance, one of the things I would like to do is I would like to get together with as many of the senior developers as I can get time with and get them to tell me what they hope to see change in the structure and the architecture of the code base. And then if I collect all of this together, maybe I can present it back to everybody and say, hey, is this our technical roadmap? So maybe that'll happen this year if I can get together with enough people and carve out enough time for that. Related to that, if I'm doing development, where are the engineering guidelines? There's a little bit on style, but in terms of really how one should approach coding, what's the right level of abstraction? When do I use inheritance? When do I use composition? How much should I be programming in a stateless functional style? When is it okay to manipulate as much state as I want? These kind of engineering guidelines, I don't think that we have these written down. This is something that each developer on the server or in each of the connectors, this is something that they know, but is not explicit. So I think we could document that. And also, I think that we've not been good about what our future roadmaps are going to be. But even though we haven't been good about this is still an area where we do naturally share it. Every time I'm at a developer meeting in an unconference or similar, the developers are always sharing what their challenges are, what the things they want to implement are and why. And so there is some knowledge about what is coming on the roadmap. It's just not written down. And so we do share this with each other. We just don't share it in a way that is very easy for people who weren't in the room to be able to learn. And so I think that this is an example where it's perfectly fine, but we could improve. Believe it or not, there's a bunch of code out there running in the world that is delivering a lot of value that is not under a version control system, that has backups with dates and times or version numbers in the file names, but is not in version control. Fortunately, version control is becoming the norm. I think especially thanks to GitHub and GitLab and the others that have made it so easy for those of us, regardless of how technical or not we are, to participate in the forking, modifying, requesting merges, seeing our changes get merged. So I think that these online platforms have made us all better users of version control system. So that's really good. And obviously, MariaDB is up on GitHub. It uses Git. If we go back through the Git history, not only do we see everything since it was transferred into Git, but we can also see the old Bazaar commits as well as the BitKeeper commits that stretch all the way back to Y2K. So that's a good one. I think that's one where we can show that it stands the test of time. And another thing that I work with all code bases on is to ensure that every line of code is getting reviewed. Every contribution, even documentation, everything should have more than one brain review it. That there's the author, and there needs to be somebody that's taking a fresh look at it as well. Let's not have the habit, as convenient as it is, of having the developer write the code, test the code, commit the code, and deploy the code, and have no sounding board to give them the insight that they overlooked something obvious. So this is something with the MariaDB ecosystem that I see is basically true in practice, but we could do this a little bit better. Specifically, we could have protected branches or enforce it otherwise. And there's times when I see request for review happen when it doesn't happen in a timely fashion. So I think we could get better about our responses to that when somebody adds a pull request, although I really, really appreciate how much work that is. And hats off to the devs that are doing that review, and I do understand that you are each very, very busy. When I think about the reviews, another area that I think we can improve a bit is we typically review the code and the tests very closely, but we think of the documentation separate as an afterthought even. And so I would like to see us, when doing some code, to also conjoin that with, and this is the change that's needed in the documentation, so that it's a single unit. And that's a bit of a stretch for us, I think, but that is an area that I think other code bases do better. And there are standards that are relevant to the MariaDB code base, specifically the SQL standard, but also, depending on which connector you're using, maybe the ODBC or JDBC or one of the other standards. And so our reviews of these contributions, are they having somebody look at not only the code and the tests, but also, is this bringing us closer to the standard? Is this unrelated to a standard, or does this bring us further away from the standard? And so this is something that I think I think it's just a place we could improve. I don't think it's a big deal, but I think it is something that we are not making explicit today, even though I think it happens more or less as it needs to on an ad hoc basis. But I think we could be more deliberate about this. And the one thought I had on this is maybe a reviewer checklist would help. I don't know if it would or not, but possibly. And another thought I have is that we don't engage enough people in the review process. People who are not developers absolutely are good candidates for documentation because they will read it as a non-developer, which is fantastic. So let's engage in our ability to do documentation as well as code. There's a lot of code I can't contribute to, but maybe I can contribute to the documentation that is of what that code is doing. So I think that we can increase the pool of people involved in the review process. Now, obviously, if I'm only working on the documentation, I can only sign off on, yes, the documentation for this looks good. I have no idea if the code is well structured, but my part, the documentation looks good. Or, hey, I don't feel like the documentation explains something that makes sense to me. Maybe the code is great. So we have to be clear, if we're only reviewing part of it, what role we are taking on in our role as a reviewer. Continuous integration is something that is important for every code base, and fortunately, due to I think largely we can give credit to the online repository hosting services like GitHub and GitLab and such. Continuous integration is becoming the norm as well, and MariaDB has had continuous integration for a very long time. It's had BuildBot since before there was Travis integrations and such, and BuildBot is continuing to improve, but it could be faster. There's often a big delay between when branch is pushed or a merge request is opened and when we see the results of BuildBot. So that's something that could be better. Also, sometimes tests fail and then they get rerun and they pass. So there's been some unstable tests historically. I understand that that there's significant effort right now to identify and resolve all of the unstable tests. Maybe that's maybe that's done now. I don't know, but that's something that I think is something that needs attention continuously. Also, test coverage is something that we don't report in the MariaDB ecosystem. So it is possible to run test coverage utilities, but we don't currently. And as a reviewer, when I'm reviewing code, I want to be confident that the code doesn't break anything, and what I'm reviewing is the structure of the code, is the clarity of the code. I don't want to have to, as a reviewer, try to be a test engine in my own head, imagining every corner case and branch condition. I would very much like to have the test suite give me confidence that the code works, so I can focus on, is it well implemented? Many code bases are doing now is they're saying you can't merge to the main development branch unless all the tests pass. And that's something I would like to see us be able to enforce in the MariaDB server code base as well, which we don't today. Documentation is an area that I think we can all participate in. So please contribute. The Standard for Public Code says you should document your objectives. Well, that's something that I think we do a reasonable job at. I think we could be more explicit about that, especially around which versions of the SQL standard and especially around to what extent we expect this database to work as an upgrade path from another database or similar. Document your code. Again, I think that if you're a developer, you're already doing a pretty good job of this. Obviously, this is something that I think few of us would say the documentation across all of the server and all the connectors is as good as we'd like it to be. So I think that that as you're working on code, also take the time to contribute to the documentation there. Use plain English. This seems really basic, but remember that not everybody reading the code is necessarily going to be a native English speaker, and therefore the documentation, whether that's in the code or on the website or anywhere the documentation is, please do your best to write it as simply and as clearly as you can. And the goal for the documentation should be to communicate. We don't have to show off how poetic we are. So anyway, use plain English, please. And I would say on the whole we do pretty well here, although I think I would like to see the per version information improve a bit, because when I'm running a particular version of MariaDB, sometimes it's not as easy to figure out which features I have and don't have. So I think there's an area there where we could improve, and there's examples we can look at in other software where they have that same kind of thing. So I think we can look at others and learn from them as well. Codebase maturity. Hey, Codebase maturity is an area where MariaDB, I think, does very well. The version numbering makes sense. It's very clear to understand when something is a release candidate or when something is prime time. So that's really good. And also the change logs are always informative and are good to give me the update I need for what changed in this version. So overall, there's a bunch of areas that I would like us in the ecosystem to consider when I look at the MariaDB ecosystem and the MariaDB server code base especially, and I compare it to the draft standard that the Foundation for Public Code is publishing. I think there's some areas that this causes me to highlight as areas we could improve, and I've talked about them, especially around documentation, reviews relative to the various standards. Can we get some branch rigor? There's more we can do in terms of testing and roadmap. Let's get some engineering guidelines together. Maybe I can work on that. And obviously the internal modularity, I think that's the most difficult one. But with all of this, most of the time what I'm talking about is we can do it the way they do it over there in MariaDB. That's a community that is doing a lot of things really right. So thank you very much, and I understand we're going to have some question times now.